Welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, where we explore the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive way forward. I'm your host, Morag, permaculture educator and global ambassador, filmmaker, eco-villager, food forester, mother, practivist, and all-round lover of thinking, communicating, and acting regeneratively. For a long time, it's been clear to me that to shift trajectory to a thriving one-planet way of life, we first need to shift our thinking. The way we perceive ourselves in relation to nature, self, and community is the core. So this is true now more than ever, and even the way change is changing. Unprecedented changes are happening all around us at a rapid pace. So how do we make sense of this? To know which way to turn, to know what action to focus on, so our efforts are worthwhile and nourishing and are working towards resilience, regeneration, and reconnection. What better way to make sense than to join together with others in open, generative conversation? In this podcast, I'll share conversations with my friends and colleagues, people who inspire and challenge me in their ways of thinking, connecting, and acting. These wonderful people are thinkers, doers, activists, scholars, writers, leaders, farmers, educators, people whose work informs permaculture and spark the imagination of what a post-COVID, climate-resilient, socially just future could look like. Their ideas and projects help us to make sense in this changing world, to compost and digest the ideas, and to nurture the fertile ground for new ideas, connections, and actions. Together we'll open up conversations in the world of permaculture design, regenerative thinking, community action, earth repair, eco-literacy, and much more. I can't wait to share these conversations with you. Over the last 3 decades of personally making sense of the multiple crises we face, I always return to the practical and positive world of permaculture, with its ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share. I've seen firsthand how adaptable and responsive it can be in all contexts, from urban to rural, from refugee camps to suburbs. It helps people make sense of what's happening around them and to learn accessible design tools to shape their habitat positively and to contribute to cultural and ecological regeneration. This is why I've created the Permaculture Educators Program, to help thousands of people to become permaculture teachers everywhere through an interactive online dual certificate of permaculture design and teaching. We sponsor global perma-youth programs, women's self-help groups in the Global South, and teens in refugee camps. So anyway, this podcast is sponsored by the Permaculture Education Institute and our Permaculture Educators Program. If you'd like to find more about permaculture, I've created a 4-part permaculture video series to explain what permaculture is and also how you can make it your livelihood as well as your way of life. We'd love to invite you to join our wonderfully inspiring, friendly and supportive global learning community. So I welcome you to share each of these conversations, and I'd also like to suggest you create a local conversation circle to explore the ideas shared in each show and discuss together how this makes sense in your local community and environment. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet and speak with you today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It's my delight to welcome you to this episode of Sense Making in a Changing World. My guest today is Suzie Cahn, an Indigenous Irish woman, permaculture teacher, leading voice in the Irish permaculture scene, and a member of the International Permaculture Collab, as well as an art therapist. Suzie and I met at Findhorn Eco Village a couple of years ago, attending the Climate Change and Consciousness Conference, and immediately became friends. You know, the kind of friendship that when you just click, and then you don't see each other, but as soon as you start speaking again, you're right back in the zone. I really love those kind of friendships. Anyway, with Suzie's family, she runs Carrigdura in the Irish West Country. It's a permaculture education farm and social enterprise that focuses on education for sustainability and empowerment. It's a permaculture centre. And through her permaculture work too, she's embracing the Irish culture. This interview is a little bit different. We're actually doing a very permacultural thing, making this podcast multifunctional. Suzie and I are interviewing each other simultaneously. She's editing this for her podcast, and I'm sharing it here with you on Sense Making in a Changing World. Come and join us for a wonderful, wide-ranging chat about living a permaculture life, teaching permaculture, setting up permaculture centres, raising kids, connecting locally, and embracing culture. Enjoy. So I'm trying something different today, and welcome everyone to the show. We're actually doing a dual recording of two podcasts. One, this Sense Making in a Changing World show, and my friend from Ireland, Suzie Cahn, is recording this for her show as well. And so this is something new, and it's an experiment, and I always love experiments. So welcome to the show. It's so great to have you here. I guess you can welcome me to your show.
I'm going to welcome you, exactly. So the podcast that I started creating this year is called Kayak or Kailak. And I think we're a pair of beginner Kailaks. And that's something that I connected with you, Morag, when I met you in Scotland. And the Kayak is someone who is the older, wise woman. And so we're kind of at the beginning of that phase of our lives where you've gone from mahir or mother, or even from, well, you might still be an enchantress kind of warrior woman, but I'm definitely heading towards elder. And so I think that we could explore our shared thoughts and proto-wisdom. I don't really claim to be wise yet, but I'm trying to get wiser.
Well, I think I know for myself, I find the wisdom in these kinds of conversations. It's when we come together that something else happens, and that's why I love sharing these podcast conversations, because it's such an interesting place to explore ideas, and I actually never really know what's going to come out of the conversation, which makes it really exciting. I always have a few kind of key things I think I'd like to ask you, but then it just goes where it goes, and that's beautiful.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think I'm the same. And in some other threads of my podcast, I am basically having a conversation with myself. But I think there's a lot of people actually in my head, so that's not that difficult. But I really also, like you, I feel like there's something that is a magic between two people that comes particularly when you're open to exploring questions and where they lead. And that I think we were both saying just before we began that we're not really thinking that we're going to find answers. It's just that there are questions that need to regularly come up in new ways, in new generations, at different times and different, to try to make sense of our world. We continually ask questions. And for me, I think probably because I grew up in Northern Ireland at a time when dogma and polarity was extreme, and it's still there to some degree, and it's raising its head again at the moment in Northern Ireland. And so I've never wanted to get to answers that leave me dogmatic.
Yeah, it's the continual asking of the questions, and that's where the magic lies. But maybe we should start a bit more.
Exactly.
I was just going to say, maybe we should start. Where do we meet? Where was our point of connection that started this conversation? Because whenever I think of you, I start to giggle. Like there's something about. It was kind of like when we met at Findhorn at a climate change and consciousness conference, and we'd both taken our children as youth members of this event as well, and we were part of a kind of like a home group. And whenever we get together, we would just start to chat and giggle. Like there was a sort of a playfulness and an openness about you, and that deep querying about what was going on that just was, I don't know, I just got attracted to your energy of somehow. And every time I think of you, I just feel happy. And so I'm so glad that we're having this chat, because I haven't seen you for ages, and it's really...
No, it's a very long time. And I think that I really trust those moments of connection, because I mean, the Findhorn for me there were a lot of magical things about that, because my sister lives near Findhorn, about 30 minutes away, and I had not been there, but she'd told me about it. My parents had visited it, and they were kind of like, "That's your sort of thing. You'd like Findhorn, that's the sort of thing you're into." And so I kept thinking I must go one day, and I hadn't been back to Scotland for a long time. I hadn't visited my sister for a long time. She'd comes to Ireland a lot, but I hadn't managed to get to her. And I thought, it's Easter, and I just spotted this climate change and consciousness conference. And I thought, you know what, I think I will go. And what I could do is I'll spend a bit of time with my sister. I'll leave my my two younger offspring with her and her kids, and I will go on up to Findhorn on my own. And I was looking forward to that because I think my kids are a good bit older than yours, or some of them are older. And so I was like, aha, I can do things on my own again. So my actual plan had been to go to Findhorn all by myself. So it's just funny whenever you say that I was there with my youngest son, because completely coincidentally, he's was at a democratic school in Ireland, and through, I think, two very random connections, Findhorn were reaching out for Irish kids, and there was somebody that knew about the Sudbury School, and then somebody said, we'd love to have more of the youth voices there. And in the end, I think there was also a random funder that said, I want specifically to fund Irish youth to come. And so the school rang me and said, so would you be up for Finn going to Scotland at Easter of this, and it was a few months away, and I said, he's already going to Scotland at Easter. I've a ticket booked on a ferry. He's going, and they're like, well, it's to this this conference. And I said, is it in Findhorn? So Finn actually came completely independently of me, where I had booked my own self, and then he basically ended up booked and going, and with all of his friends, and his other sibling ended up staying at my sister's, and Finn came up with me.
Yeah, so my eldest was the one who came into the conference with me. I think at the time she must have been 12.
Yeah.
And so my two youngest were staying with Evan over in another part of Findhorn, and it was a turning point for her. It was absolutely meeting your son and all the friends in that group, and just feeling the power of the youth voice and seeing what was possible, and seeing that there's a different perspective that you can have, and holding that space and being in that youth forum. So, since then she's ended up quitting school, going back to homeschooling. She's set up things like Perma Youth. She runs philosophy groups. She's just stepped into her space as being a leader, and it's phenomenal. It's absolutely, it's a point for her that I think she'll look at throughout her entire life as one of those key moments, those key turning points.
Yeah. I think it was certainly like that for my youngest son too, and it's still like he also would have come back to Ireland. He got involved in school strikes, and he did a run down the country to kind of highlight things, and he kind of plugged me into some of the youth in Ireland, but he was hitting an older age, and he's now just done a year of college. And actually, he's kind of in a different space now, having done a lot of that activism, of trying to return to what does he get to do for himself, and what's the obligation to do for the world, for others, and he's a musician and a creative, and he's really in a place now of figuring out his privilege and what does he do with that, and but can he also have fun and be young still and make music more? And so it's really, but he would also track back to that, even that waking up, moment to thinking about those things, to facing those kinds of challenges that their generation are facing, about what they need to do in the world.
There's something about both the way that, I guess, the educational environment that you've created and surrounded your children in. And I guess maybe similarly here, that created the possibility for what they saw there to land. And I wonder whether you
Yeah,
want to talk a bit about the kind of the way that the educational platform was not a platform, but the educational
yeah.
environment that
I
you
guess
created.
I guess it's, the interesting thing is for me that I sometimes feel like I'm part of a resistance that is, almost done in the secret places, in the hidden places. And I think for me there's a cultural piece of that. I remember meeting another Australian permaculturist who came over for a different conference in London, the International Permaculture Conference. Her name's April. You probably
Okay.
know of her, yeah. And she stayed at our farm, and she said, "Oh, the thing you're talking about, we call tall poppy syndrome in Australia." And I said, we don't have that expression. But for her, it was like if you stick your head up too high, then the scythe will get you, and you get your head chopped off. And I think that one of the cultural pieces of equipment that we have in Ireland is not putting your head up high, actually, is quietly and in the marginal places and in the edges doing something that's resisting, and not necessarily shouting about it. Although there's moments when I was young in my 20s, and I definitely was involved in protest in that straight up way. But I think as a mother, I did things that were less in the face of something and more in the, but it was still resisting. It was still, and resisting is really an ongoing and challenging energy if you don't just opt out entirely, which I think um, I think now, what if there had been community around me? What if there had been enough other people in that resistance? That's come late, because I have 4 kids, and my eldest will be 27 this summer, and so the period where, and he did go through a period of homeschooling and so on, but I think that the communal resistance, the more like the school that Finn went to was started by another mother, and it was like there was all these other people looking for another way in education by the time Finn came along, whereas it was a bit of a more lonely journey
Mm.
where I was aware of things I didn't like about the mainstream education system, and I was very aware of things that weren't fitting my children, and some more than others. And yet I didn't, I was, so I think what I did was something that maybe I also had by luck or whatever, for myself, is I did not fit in the mainstream school system myself, especially not primary school. And but what was surrounding me was actually a lot of community, and was a lot of time in nature and being able to be a wild child. And and so I think the environment that you're trying to draw out of my experience was, well, maybe if I just create enough of other influences,
Mm.
maybe if around them, so some will go to school, some won't, some will be homeschooled, but that they'll encounter. So through our kind of permaculture hub, we've had so many different people come from all over the world and from Ireland, and also the spaces that I could create or send them to, or to just know that there's diversity in the world, and there's not a one size fit all, and that there's 100 million pathways to your own identity and to your own. So now I like what I've been watching in my children as they do that thing where they shed lots of the identity that you might have had around them, or like your identity, or your, what you like, what you're passionate about, what you're into. And they go, well, let's just shake the trees and see how much of that we're keeping and see what is new for us. I feel like they at least have a lot of choice about their values, their passions, their identity. But I also get the feedback, because of course now they tell me what I got wrong. And one of the things that the feedback is that by living on the edge and not having supportive community, and living on the edge of the mainstream system, they also didn't have full housing security. They didn't have full economic security, and they were, in a way, exposed to educational concepts and ideas that are quite common in people who do have affluence, who can travel maybe or send their kids to an international school, or but they had this kind of exposure to other ideas, but they lived in a family with an economy that was closer to people without money or without those opportunities, and it's actually confused them lots, because it's they all talk about, kind of wanting the comfortable home, and these things they could see peers having. And because we were resisting, because my husband and I were both going, no, we're not going up the corporate ladder, in his case, when he got into computing, and then could have risen up a corporate computing ladder, but kind of bugged out and was like, I can't do this, so I'm getting out of here. And so that resistance in me too, whereas in the arts and then art therapy and then nature-based education and community gardens and school gardens and then permaculture holding and so on, and eco-village friends and alternative friends and working class friends and all these different things, that it was actually very confusing for them to try to say, why do we not get the benefits of the bloody system? Like, could we not have had some of that, please? You made these choices, but we actually suffered the consequence of those choices. And
that's interesting.
I mean, they're great. They're very forgiving as well, but they're really, if you bring up your children to have a voice, then they're pretty articulate with that voice later on. So, and they're going, and now. So I don't know. I mean, for me, I'd be really curious about that for you, and whether any of your experience of the culture you were brought up in, and the in our lifetime, this deepening of the divide and the kind of post, like late stage capitalism and post colonial legacies of damage and great degradation of land and people, and I'd be curious whether that you were conscious of resisting it, or providing an alternative for in your life and in your children, and what happened for you. Like, I don't know where it begins for you.
Well, as I was listening to you, I felt like you were sort of describing how I feel about it too, that as I was also a protester in my teens, going out, whatever was particularly around protecting forests. There were peace rallies. There was a whole lot of different things happening at the time, uranium mining. So I was constantly on the streets talking about different things. And I think I got to the point where I did get a bit burnt out by that. I got to the point of thinking, no one's even listening. No one even really cares about this. There's a few of us who just keep on pushing and resisting, but it's not being heard. And so I think there was a few other things that were going on in my life at that time. I was in my late teens, a lot of angst of all sorts of kinds. We don't really need to go into that, but I think I retreated for a year. I just went into a little bubble, and I just felt deeply hurt by society in so many ways, and just had to take that all in. Like, I didn't get brought up in an eco village or a permaculture community, but I was brought up in a suburb in Melbourne. Mum and dad were public servants, so we weren't rich, but we weren't poor either. We had enough to eat. We always had, clean clothes on our back and off to school. It was a very standard kind of upbringing. But yet within that, there was a resistance that I felt coming through with my parents. Like, they built their house with their own hands. They designed it to be, oriented to collect the sun and the thermal heat, and they had natural foods, and they filled the backyard and the front yard with native plants which would attract the birds, and whereas everyone else had the lawns, and it was different, like the house didn't face the street, which was what you meant to do. It faced the sun. The garden was not neat. It was wilderness, and tucked in amongst that were fruit trees and pots of herbs, and they brought us up as vegetarians, and so if you go out somewhere, back then there weren't vegetarian meals. They're just going to go, oh, you're vegetarian, scrape off the meat and give you the peas and carrots, so it's sit there. So we didn't go out very much to sort of events. It was a very kind of quiet upbringing, but it felt like there was a resistance in that. There was something about caring for what was happening. Particularly my mum was around what was going on in the planet, with wildlife, and my dad particularly had a focus on ethics and being socially just, and that was all. And he talked about he introduced me to permaculture thinking and ideas. And so, as an activist, it was sort of a natural fit. It was like, well, you're always talking about solar and not harming anything, and so I just naturally went into this activism mode. But when I got burnt by it and society and came back to think, I thought, well, what do I do with this? Where do I go? And I had really no interest. I remember I was studying landscape architecture at the time, and I remember actually thinking, well, I don't actually really care about what they're teaching us here. They're teaching us how to become a designer for landscapes for the rich and anyone who has money for us to. We have this suburb in Melbourne called Toorak, which was kind of like, well, everyone was aspiring to be a landscape architect for Toorak houses. And I just saw this absolute pointlessness in spending all your life just to do that. So I started exploring ways of weaving permaculture in with that, the landscape architecture, and think about design with nature. And I remember being told at university, design with nature, that's passé. And, we need to be focusing on these, contemporary methods of design. I just felt like punched in the stomach by that. And I quit. And I had I think one term left to go. I didn't want to be part of that system. And I left, and I went off to Schumacher College and studied with Fritjof Capra and Vandana Shiva and Satish Kumar, and just tried to sort of explore different ideas and go to where do I come from as well? Where do I belong? So I started traveling into Scotland and across to Ireland, because that's where my roots are. But I knew nothing of it. When you grow up in Australia, you're in this place. You have this sense of that it's not your place. You know that, but you don't have another place that is your own either. Even though you feel part of the colonizer group, you're also migrants and in some ways, from ancestors, also refugees. And I know I can't possibly even begin to relate to the current existence of refugees, but there's this sense of displacement that's in that. And so I've spent a bit of time talking with Indigenous elders about this. But I mean, just before I go down that line of thought, though, and just back on that resistance idea, that I did feel a shift too when my children were born, that there are so many different ways to be strong and to I guess what I've tried to do with my life is to be in a place where I can live and be fully present in what it is that I feel are the most important values to me, and that there's an integrity about that. And so that when I speak or when I teach, that it's from that place. It's not something that I'm going, well, we should be doing this or we should be doing that or you should change, or, you know, it's all that kind of abouting about it. It's like, well, let's just be it and see what happens and then share from that place. And that's kind of the resistance model, is just being it, and raising children in a way that is helping them to see past the corporate gloss. Or, you know, I was having a really interesting conversation about Minecraft with my son the other day. You know, like we have this ongoing dialogue. We'd avoided having computer game type of stuff in our house for a very long time, and he discovered it and he loves it. And I've had to kind of really open up my whole thinking about what that means and how and so we were on a journey somewhere. I love actually going on a journey with them in the car every now and then, just because it gives me a chance, like a one-on-one. You're locked in this car with me for the next hour. I'm going to have a really good go at having a conversation with you where you can't be distracted by all the things around. And we started to talk about all the inherent bias and values that are in games, and he can see, he looks at advertising, he's critical of what he sees around him. But when it came to the game, he just had his blinkers on. And so we had these, I said, what about if, I've noticed you on there as I've walked past, that you're chopping this monoculture crop of sugarcane or something. I said, like, what if you got more points on a game like that for adding diversity? Like, the more diverse crops you had in your Minecraft farm, the more points you would get, and that you start to inherently shift the way that people think and the values they're getting by adding. So, like, my resistance comes in many forms. I'm trying to find ways to, still have the same kind of conversations and open up the dialogue with them through the lens that they're currently in. And rather than, I realize the more that I push against that, the more that I see him going into that world and rejecting what it is that I represent or the conversations that we can have openly. And so, oh gosh, it's hard, but so the resistance is in the everyday conversations that you have wherever you are, and
yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess that like this this phrase that has been in many of my conversations in pretty much every, like, of my spheres of chats in the last year, and so many of them have been online, of course, but that that has actually lent a more international dimension, and in some ways a more inclusive dimension, although I would still say not really that inclusive. But there's been more edges. But I think the things uh, that have come to a stronger light, the deep and deepening inequality in the world, and the justice, and the conversations about climate justice, and who's feeling the effects of the world inequality that this got. So even if you knew it before and you were aware of deep inequality, that the COVID situation has just like shone such a torch to show it, where it's, even for those who might have been in a state of denial about it, cannot deny it. So then they're faced with choices about, do we continue, like at the moment in the question of what do we take the benefits of capitalism and the benefits of our privilege, and or like, what do you do? And I suppose that question that you're saying for your son with the Minecraft, it's no different than well, would you like the vaccine? It's like, it's like, well, do you take it or do you? And if you withhold this is something I definitely grappled with the children. When what I was saying that they've come back with a bit, which is if you withhold these privileges, you just make us crave them. We just want them because they are there. And I suppose I've been interested in the decolonial conversation about, is it just enough to acknowledge your privilege and to do something with that as much as you can, to say, I have a great amount of privilege. Um, and I have, but I think also those insights of the people on the edges, of the resistance. It's this strange thing of not, like, I know that the like the culture that your parents were doing things for themselves and building a house for themselves and growing food for themselves is one of the forms, definitely, of resistance, of saying, okay, I'm not going to support this other exploitative system. There's a writer here in Ireland, Mark Boyle, who wrote The Moneyless Man, and then he's since gone on and written several other books, but one of them, his most recent one, was experimenting with how far do you take it, and he came off of all violence in the term as an individual that he could, as a consumption experiment. Like, could he have nothing that is made and through an exploitative violence of the colonial capitalist world, so that brought him back down to candlelight and, not much else, like no electricity, no, so he wrote his latest book, by longhand. And what he talks about is, like, what did he gain from that as an individual as well? And he gained a lot of old man friends down the road who were the only ones who at the time that it was on the same kind of time frame that he was, that had the time to stand at the edge of a field and talk. And he gained, a whole different mental state for writing by hand, and how he composed his thoughts and all of these things. And, I have definitely got those leanings. I have definitely got the complete and switch off the grid and, almost hermit-like existence to just feel free for 1 minute of the inherent violence of my privileged life. That's all those invisible acres and all those invisible social justice things that feed me and allow us to talk on this computer. And, so it's almost like I feel like that conversation with our children is around, how do we live within this, with our privilege, with these access. And you certainly, to go down the route of, my husband brings in the balance, I think, because, and that's, I think, a good thing for me, to say, that living the life of like, how does one individual, I think that there's something one of my children actually talks about, is that is the ultimate success of a capitalist system, is to make you believe it is you as an individual that has to, that's an argument that a lot of that system promoters be very happy having with you. Oh yeah, which individual choice would you like to make, this one or that one? And that they love us to stick to that rather than to look at it systemically and in a holistic sense. So in some ways, that's the resistance as well with our children, to not say it's actually not got to do with you as an individual playing Minecraft. That's really not what we're needing to worry about here. Your individual choices aren't but it is that greater awareness, like you're trying to give, of the system we live within and the choices that you'll then be faced with, and the things that we have privileges within, but also the things we don't. Yeah.
I think for me, the thing that, because there's so many questions about it, and you don't see the privilege that you have until you sort of faced, it's just inherent in everything, isn't it? And so this conversation has started to unpack so many different things. And what I found so useful is to just open up conversations. So I've just faced my uncertainty, the questions I have, and not go, oh, well, I don't know. I'll just kind of continue on. It's like, I actually really don't know what I'm supposed to be doing here. This is new for me. And I know that I don't see a whole lot of stuff. And just be in that open space. And so I was starting to say earlier that I spent a bit of time with an Indigenous elder. He's not actually from this land. He's from the Gumbaynggirr land, which is just south of here, but he spends a lot of time in this area, and he's always up for a chat. I often see him in town, and I just sit down so we went down to a little park next to the neighbourhood centre that he'd been involved in setting up with, bush foods. And as we're walking down there, he's picking off all these berries. He said, oh, each one of these berries has a different flavour. Can you check them out as we're going along? Like, we're having this sort of bush tucker feast as we're going along. We get down, we sit down in this little yarning circle that he created there. And I started asking him about this question about, well, I don't really know what I'm meant to do about this, and where I fit and where I'm from, or what voice I have within all of this. And one of the things that just struck me so much about this whole conversation, I actually recorded this conversation, I think it's up on the YouTube somewhere, was that I recorded one of the conversations that I'd had with him. And we were talking about, because I said, I have ancestors in Ireland and Scotland, and I know my mum was from England. She came from England, but her ancestors were from Wales. And so, like, there's all this kind of history there. But I was born in Melbourne, and I kind of feel like I'm part of the problem. And he says, well, where exactly in Melbourne were you born? Where are you from? And so we started talking that, I'm from near the Mullumbimby River, and my land is from the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I always felt like, well, that's not my right to ever say that I'm from that land, because I'm not. But he actually said, no, you are. You were born there. That is your land. And you don't have the dreaming, but you have the responsibility to connect with that land and to be with that land and care for that land and to be a steward with us of that land. And it just transformed how I thought. Rather than being sort of someone who's kind of a part of the colonizers, part of the problem, we always get stuck in this. And I think one of the things that makes us so stuck here in Australia is the guilt. And a lot of people don't want to face it, so they'll just kind of turn the other cheek. And so, but then if you get caught in the guilt, then you become stuck as well. And so finding a way to land. So it's being in conversation. Have the great honor to have an enormous amount of women elders around me at the moment who I can just ask them questions, and they just tell me if I'm being an idiot or not, or and just being straight up. So the part of this, I think, the process of decolonization is to be in the conversation, is to like, I think we talked about this before, is to be asking the questions, to be open to change your script, to be open to not have a script at all, because we don't have one for this. And
in those conversations that you're having, like, I'd be really interested because of permaculture's origins, and you said even your dad was telling you about it, in Australia. And I have these little snippets of stories, and sometimes you have a story that isn't the truth, but it contains a greater truth, and there's a way that they say, like, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Meaning that there's something in it. And so I don't know if these have any facts in them, but the stories that I have is I'm going to tell you, and I just would be interested to hear. I understood from, a friend of a friend in America who came over to Australia and worked with Bill Mollison and then there was these other pieces about, in Mollison's book, there's this image that is, from my understanding, is it's from some kind of, Aboriginal worldview and imagery. And then there's pieces that make some in the book acknowledgement of the inspiration from Aboriginal people in permaculture. So the story that I have is that Mollison knew that he had gotten huge inspiration for Aboriginal people, but he didn't talk. He allegedly didn't talk about that. This is this guy in America that knew him told another person that told me that he didn't talk about it too much because he thought that it would create another thing that people could show up like they show up to get Aboriginal art or to extract some other thing or some other wisdom by a kind of extractive, non-generative, means of saying, we'll have some of that as well, please. We'd like your, so this is perhaps an allegory. It may not be true at all, but even if it were true or not true, it is something that Indigenous people around the world have been vocal about, the codification of their wisdom and connection to holistic understanding of ecosystem and intelligence and ecosystem management and restoration and living in balance and so on. And that it does seem like, for me, that ecology and permaculture are like a translator for Western science educated people. That it's like, but often not acknowledged and often not honored, I suppose, with its lineage. And that, for me, is something that I've certainly been talking about on our permaculture course this year. I kind of said some of this in, we always do a kind of big community welcome to all the diversity that's there and to the ancestry of the people and the land that we're on and all the peoples that have been on the land. We don't have that exact dreaming, but with the Celtic knowledge, or the pre-Celtic knowledge, it's kind of there that there is they think a continuous, the most recent studies of, I think, bog remnants is that there's people on this land for 33,000 years. So we're around a long time on as continual, connection to this island. And so what my question is, what's your thinking about that as an Australian permaculturist who has access to perhaps repair and not extraction of just, going back to the Aboriginals and say, well, now could you help us decolonize ourselves, actually? Now that we're waking up, could you be once again, like gifting us this, or do we extract it, or how do we do it in a healthy exchange that's not, that's not so easily like corrupted by what I think my eldest son says, and capitalism swallows everything. It's like, how do we not let that happen again if we're really being in dialogue and being in conversation?
It's a really, really interesting question, and there's lots of different aspects to the response that I have as well. So one of the things that happens within the courses that I run is that anyone who wants to join from Indigenous community is welcome to, and we join in as part of a conversation actually one woman just joined the other day. She has a background in nutrition, and she's exploring her Indigenous foods from that perspective. And she did a permaculture course a little while ago, actually. And she said while she was doing it, she just had this moment of realization that permaculture and Indigenous ways of thinking just fitted so beautifully, and that it gave her kind of a platform and a voice for also sharing that. And so we're going to start working together. She's come into this course to revisit that. She went off then on a tangent. She went into university. She started doing a PhD and just went, oh, hang on a tick, wrong direction, right topic, but wrong direction. So she's coming back in to really just immerse herself in permaculture thinking in a way that will see how we can have this dialogue, so that how the permaculture thinking can inform how she revisits her knowledge of place, at the same time as permaculture being informed by how she sees the principles and the ethics and the way of describing permaculture. And I think the thing is that for me, there's like multiple descriptions of permaculture anyway. So, you know, I'm also working at the same time with refugees throughout East Africa, and they're describing permaculture as something which fits within their worldview. But so there's a whole group of women that I'm working with in Australia at the moment who are exploring their indigeneity. Like they might have been brought up with part of that knowledge, but not all of it, and feel kind of lost as well between worlds. And that permaculture, they're finding, is actually a way that's kind of like a bridge, that it's a bridge between, like you're saying, the scientific world or the Western world, but is deeply rooted and resonates with them. It speaks to them. Like there's so many conversations that I've had that it's been an entirely embracing of it, but redescribing it in language that makes sense. And another woman, for example, down in a bit further south from me, and Gambungi woman, again, and that's sort of the Coffs Harbour, south of Byron Bay area there, sort of ocean people. And she's exploring the seasonal calendars of plants and the stories of plants and the dreaming of plants, and then how do you start to then create Indigenous food gardens that can be shared. So rather than, you know, because we, you know, people still want to grow, you know, carrots and cabbages and, you know, food from places that it doesn't belong. So there's a big shift to that. But at the same time, I also have other conversations with elders from other places, like an amazing woman called Lila Watson, who's grown up in an incredibly strong, vocal Indigenous family that have been resisting for a really long time. And she said, well, you know, there's some key issues here. One is around access to land. Like very few Indigenous people have access to land to even begin to regenerate the type of food systems that we want. Another one is that, you know, once the foods get discovered, if it does go into a corporate thing, so like Kakadu plum, for example, Kakadu plum has been identified as having one of the highest vitamin C's, but if the Kakadu plum is grown in the forest community, then it has the connectedness to all the other species. It's grown in a community. If you take it out of its community, plonk it over here, it will not have the same qualities. It won't have the same healing qualities. It's extracted from its context, and context is everything. So they're saying, one, it's destroying what it is by separating it, and secondly, what it's doing is it's then taking our knowledge, corporatizing it, and putting it in a way that we don't ever get any value back from that. It's just an extraction of knowledge. So there are all these dimensions of it. Some people saying permaculture is really well, I mean, that's not permaculture, that's agriculture. So I think the value coming in through permaculture is seen, what I'm experiencing anyway, is really important. I'm just about to head up in a couple of weeks to the northern part of Australia, up near Cairns in the rainforest, is coming together to explore how they're going to move forward, because they're stuck. And they've said, look, we've got land up here, but we're kind of a little bit of a loss what we're going to do with it. We've got this land, and it was an old banana plantation, which was huge amounts of chemicals. The land was degraded. It was cleared of the rainforest. We need to work out how to regenerate it and how to find a way to access the knowledge.
And have they lost that knowledge? Would they express that they've lost that knowledge because of the what's happened in the education or their?
Yeah, well, because they've been taken off country. Most people have been shifted to places, so the country they're from and the stories they have and the knowledge that's embedded in all of that has just been all mixed up. And so when you come to a place and you land in a place and you get given a piece of land, it's not necessarily the land that you're from. It might be somewhere nearby, but it's not. It doesn't have those.
How is that happening? How are they reaccessing land?
Well, their particular piece of land, I think, is quite unusual that they have. So this is one particular community, Jumbun community, which is one of the groups up there that have access to quite a significant piece of land that back in the 1970s, I think, was bought for them.
Okay.
And there's a small community. Oh, well, I think it was by the government.
Okay.
So there were
sort of resettlement programs of saying you can have this bit of land because we've taken this other bit of land.
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right.
And then they managed to get a few other bits and pieces and have this. So now a big hurricane came through a little while ago and knocked out all the banana plantations, which were chemical banana plantations. They weren't growing traditionally. And that was kind of the main source of income. It was a really good income for them for a while. That got taken out. They didn't have any resources to be able to rebuild it. And now they're going, well, actually, we don't want to rebuild that. We've had a pause. We realise now we actually want to do something completely differently. How do we do that? We want to integrate with that, our bush food knowledge and bring back our stories and sit together with people who have an understanding of how to think in a way to regenerate land and just see where we go, where we get to. And so we're having a circle up there in the next few weeks to talk about that. And who knows what's going to come of it. The idea is that it's integrating eco-village. It's with the global eco-village network as well. Okay. So looking at what are the ways of regenerating economy, thinking about housing, water, wastewater, food systems, because they really have so little up there and very little access to resources to do it.
And do you think that I noticed some stuff coming out of the global eco-village movement recently that seems to be moving more into alignment in a justice way, like into work that's social justice and maybe a different like in service to kind of using the knowledge and the resources, or maybe it's simply paying it back, having taken it forward one way. It's like saying, well, we have all this and actually it comes from your people and it comes from your ancestors and we'd like to show up and return it. Is that something you've noticed too? Because I'm not that connected with the global eco-village. I don't live in an eco-village, and I but permaculture sort of circles and transition town circles tend to intersect eco-village circles.
Yeah.
So I hear bits and
definitely.
pieces.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, my world, even though I live in an eco-village, my world is more in that of permaculture and permaculture service work, wherever that might be, whether it be with youth, with Indigenous communities, and with refugees. So that's kind of my main area of work. What I find really interesting about this particular direction that Genoa is taking, which is the Oceania region, is that they're mostly working with a lot of Indigenous groups, whether you're talking about Koreans or, various countries through Southeast Asia to Indigenous communities here. There is, that is the big focus. It is about decolonizing the concept of an eco-village and reframing what an eco-village means, because that is what what is one planet living? What is living in a way that is nourishing the planet, rebuilding traditional cultures, all of those things at the same time. And that seems to, what I'm seeing is that by going into a community like that, it's not going in saying, okay, we've got an answer for you, and here's the eco-village design cards, and this is what you do. And, it's the same with permaculture. Like, you would never do that. It's just, you go and you open up conversations to explore what this means and how that relates to that. And somewhere you find that point of connection. And then once you find those points of connection, then you start to explore other things. And then they'll say, oh, well, actually that bit there looks like it would be really helpful for us. And we see how that relates to us. And then it's just kind of this it's a weaving that happens. And, some gets left off. Oh, well, that's irrelevant to us. We don't need that bit, or we're going to re-describe it as that. And what I hear often, and I remember this even in Indonesia, like 20 odd years ago, working with communities there, they're saying, we really appreciate you bringing this, because we'd been told, like in the 1970s, when the Green Revolution just swept the islands of Indonesia, they were swept at gunpoint saying, give us all your old seeds, take these ones, use these chemicals, do this, rip out those, food for us, and expand your crops into, larger fields. And this whole transformation happened so violently and so rapidly in those places that, some had kept little seeds aside, or, little corners of food forests in, valleys somewhere. And then when you come and you share stories about seed saving and food forests and, all the stuff that's within permaculture, they said, that's it. Like, that's what we had
recognize
before.
It.
Recognize it totally. And so it's not saying that this is permaculture and we own it. It's saying this is a pattern that people everywhere can recognize and can relate to when you look at that. And so I think it's really, I think it's totally dependent on how you explain what permaculture is and how you open conversations about how we use permaculture.
So I have kind of a question about that, because as you were saying that, and as you said, so of course you wouldn't go in a permaculture where you would not go. And I'm thinking, Morag, I know maybe you wouldn't, but I'm not so sure that that's true of everybody that's going around the world, bringing permaculture. And I experienced this because I basically wouldn't do it. I got invited several times to go and do overseas work in permaculture, and there were lots of reasons why, different age of my children and stage of life and other needs. But I started going, okay, I'm kind of tempted just to at least explore and know that this system that I am working with here in Ireland is universally applicable to a deeper understanding of land and regeneration. And so we did two different things. One, we took a family trip as a charity rally, and we drove from Ireland to Mongolia with a van to donate. It was part of a charity that did this thing. And on the way, I visited some permaculture students that I'd known in Ireland who were in Poland. And then I also told the charity, look, I have no idea if my skill set is of any use in Mongolia, but we're going to stay an extra period of time. And if there's somewhere that I can do something, just tell me and I'll try and do something. And what happened was that, I could have been kidnapped, honestly. The people that I did interact with, who were in a different reason for the displacement in Mongolia. They would have had Russia and China, and still do, at their door, and even they've kind of made friends more with Japan and Korea because they feel safer in their hands. But it's still, capitalism's rife, and rushing in to build airports and extract minerals and so on. But the Mongolians themselves, the reason that they need to change their food production systems is the same reason all over the world, where there is increased urbanization, increased people going to the city. And so, but it's sort of really, there's an interesting, like the climatic conditions, the resistance of the land itself almost, and the environment is such that, like, it's only 3 million people in a vast, vast landscape, and about 1.5 million of them live in Ulaanbaatar, the biggest city, and everybody else still lives on the steppe. And the things that were forcing them to change were climate change. That they had stories of something called a zood, which was a severe winter when their herds, and they have different herds depending on where they are in Mongolia. They have sheep and goats in some places, but they have camel and yak and a lot of horses, as their herd. But whatever that was, whatever the meat and milk that they survived on, that would have happened maybe once every 100 years, a bit like 100-year flood or 100-year storm. They had 100-year freezing winters, and then their herd would die off, and it was zood, it was a famine. And they're happening all the time now, like every couple of years. And so or even every year. So the cattle, or the herd, or whatever the herd is under threat, and that's pushing more people to cities and towns. And what was very interesting, though, in the conversations that I had with lots of different people in different projects that I got to visit and share, was that they actually really have such a deep connection to being food producers, and at that base level producer, not extracted. Although there's an attempt. I mean, I met somebody in the Ministry of Agriculture, and it was so interesting. If I was meeting someone in the Ministry for Agriculture in Ireland in 2013, I'd have still be trying to convince them climate change was a thing. But when I started my conversation with saying, so what are the changes in your environment? What are the things? Why do you need any other system? What's changing? And with him, it was like, well, okay, well, so there's climate change. It was like, move on, let's get to the solutions. There was no convincing needed. It was lived experience of their lands. But the thing that was interesting was that there was still an attempt to sell meat through a series of middlemen into the city. That was still happening. But what was also happening was in the Ger district around the city, where they weren't supposed to keep any herds, all the people living in what would look like shantytown, maybe if it was India, or or somewhere where there'd been refugees displaced in Africa, and from one country to another, where you have tin hut shantytown. It was kind of shantytown poor, except that they brought with them all their traditional knowledge. So they were living in warm gers, they weren't cold, and they all had herds that they weren't supposed to have in the city, but everybody kept a few something, and they walked them out of the city onto the steppe at night, brought them in at night and milked them and ate things. And so there was this connection to, we are still, capitalism hasn't taken away our means of production. We can still produce for ourselves, and still kind of a really strong interest, even though they have no tradition of eating vegetables of any kind. And it was, but in Western Mongolia, I met some women who were growing vegetables, and it was really interesting for me. I was really fascinated by a community meal that I was involved in being invited into in a ger, and there was a piles of things and a shared meal that you just ate. They tried to give me a fork at one point, but they couldn't find it. But there was just a kind of this, and the really interesting thing was that the men were still eating all the meat in the meal, and there were a lot of preserved jars of pickled vegetables, and the women were demolishing them, and they'd grown them and they were eating them, but the men were kind of not really eating them. And I was just, it blew my mind. I was like, is it because they don't want to adopt a new vegetable? Like, is it that, or is it nutrients that the women are going, yeah, I really want more of this. I like my body's saying, I quite like this. It was so interesting. But so that was the only time, and I didn't stay, and I was invited to go back and to do a lot more, but I didn't feel the level of comfort or ability to do that at the time in my life, and so I didn't do any more overseas permaculture work or anything like that. But it was interesting to begin the thoughts, and then I don't know if you know Albert Bates, um, who's a global eco-village educator, and Albert has taught in the Clough-Jordan eco-village in permaculture for intermittently for quite a lot of years, and I had done my PDC with him, and we had connected, and I'd been on the same teaching team, and we'd had lots of nice chats. So he started trying to persuade me to come to Belize last year, and well, 2 or 3 years ago actually, and I kept sort of pushing back and saying, I don't know why you want a white woman from Ireland to come and teach in Belize. I don't understand the request. Like what? And it's like there's a 30-year Mayan Mountain permaculture project there with, and then I had met Chris and his partner Celine in the same international permaculture conference in London, and so they just kept trying to persuade me to come, and eventually, I was like, I don't know, why do you want? And they said, well, it's the community stuff you bring, it's the female stuff you bring. We previously had Starhawk, and we previously had Maddie Hartland of Permaculture Magazine come, and we want someone in that niche. And that was just like, first of all, by the way, Starhawk's a bit of a hero, so it was a bit like, you want me to fill Starhawk's shoes? That's not intimidating at all. But I wanted to ask you by way of that, because when I did go in the end, it was partly because their funder pushed them to say, why have you been teaching permaculture, but you don't have Indigenous local teachers that you've passed this on to? And the funder said, if we're going to fund you, we need to see you hand it on. And so I was like, okay, now I'll come. If that's what you're doing in this piece of work, now I'm interested. If you want to take what the white Americans have brought, even though it's 30 years, to Belize, and you want to see the people that have taken your course from the Indigenous groups of Belize, and they're there and they're interested in bringing it into their own communities, in reclaiming it in their own wisdom, in that way. So I went and it was really interesting. There were 5 teachers who had done the course before, who were then meant to be doing a sort of a teacher track with us to then take it away again. And about day 3, I had said in the beginning, when we had I did opening circle, and I said I'd love to hear from all of us, because there was people from America there, Guatemala, Belize. I said I'd love to hear, like you just talked about, where are your ancestors from? Where are your people from? And where were you born, but where are your people from? And it was lovely, because we went around in the group, and there was an American young woman teacher, and she talked about her ancestors being probably Irish, but then becoming poor dirt farmers in the south of America. And this kind of, so everybody kind of shared different things. And for me, it was, I needed this as an education in Belize, because there are many different groups in Belize. There are Mesquite Indian in northern Belize, there's East Indian, that came later, but there's also Mayan people that we were mostly connected to in the Mayan mountains, and with the village that we were there, and the Mayan people that were coming up to the course from up the river, from just where we were, and the Garifundai, which was a whole amazing story of a African tribe who were one of the few African tribes captured en masse, who mutinied and escaped their boats and were never enslaved, and ended up on an island with what were called red Caribs, and then because the British were not very happy this had happened, decided to come and try and annihilate them or capture them again, and they did, and they brought them to a island off of Belize and Guatemalan coast, and there were indentured and enslaved Irish people. And the Garafundi people came there and they said to the Irish people, break them so that they will be slaves for us and, work them hard. And the Irish apparently basically said, no, we're not going to do your work to enslave people. We've already been enslaved by you. And so they got them all and got them escaped off the island and sent them to the coast of Belize and Guatemala. And I met one of their elders who, whenever I was, there, she said, oh, well, I was in your country in Ireland because we considered ourselves to have a blood debt to the Irish. And one of your former presidents is involved in a herbalist women's circle, and they were trying to reclaim your knowledge of herbs, and she's a plant woman of the Garafundi, and they funded her to come to Ireland for 2 years to work with secret Irish women's circles of herbalism to help try to refine. So there's like sort of this mad sort of stuff. But one of the things that happened in that circle was I said, I'm a strange phenomenon because I am white and I have the privilege of being a white European. I don't get checked at airports. I can travel the world and use this white passing privilege and also wealth that was from, what's happened to Ireland in a kind of neoliberal capitalist world. But I'm also could be considered a white indigenous person because I'm of the land that my people are from. And but I'm a mixture because there were some of my people came from Scotland and some, may have mostly fled as refugees, but, they're parts of these tribes. And so I just mentioned this when I was trying to describe my ancestry in that opening circle. And 3 days later, when basically these teachers are so supposed to be going to be teachers, there was one young woman amongst them who was just furious. She just felt like she was being patronized by some of the way that the teaching was going on that wasn't acknowledging its wisdom and its tradition. And there was almost going to be a mass leaving. And the mass leaving didn't happen because this Garafundi older woman sort of sat them all down and said, let's go talk to Suzie, remember that white indigenous woman? and it was just such a funny thing because I really don't want to claim indigeneity in that way, and I felt a little like a false, moment of like, oh no, what have I said? But it did actually, what you're saying, it did create a bridging moment. And so we sat together and talked and through the way that I continued to teach on the course, I mean, there was one moment where Albert said, "Oh, could you teach that game, with the ecosystem and the string?" So I assume you know this game, where everybody has an element, a creature or a plant of an ecosystem, and you figure out who eats whom and what the exchanges of nutrients are. I said, "You want me to do that in a moist rainforest in Belize? I'm from Ireland." So I said, okay, I'm game. I will do this. So I had actually a lot of fun because what I did was I said, okay, I know nothing, but I know you know who the top predators are. And I know you know who. So within this teaching group and we did it and we did all who eats him and what's their plant and we created it together. And then I thought, I'm going to keep going with this because I've used this game before for transition towns stuff. So I said, okay, now I want you to do it again. But now could you tell me from your people, what were the exchanges in a village before you found yourselves, being corrupted or corroded or broken apart or fragmented like the old people? Either your old people or as far back as you can tell me, let's pick up some roles. So then they picked up these roles of the different things people exchanged in the village, including one very hilarious thing that was to do with, I can't say it, but the more they did this, by the way, the more they all went into the common language amongst all their different is yes English, but actually it's pidgin, so they all were kind of getting more animated, and I had been with them by then a week, and I love language and I love listening and picking up. So they're throwing out pidgin and I start throwing out pidgin too, and they're in stitches because I'm obviously not doing a very good job, but they can't believe I've even picked up any of it, but there was something, I think it was called a cut job man, something like this, and it was basically it's the person who still exists in Belize today, who is like the odd job man. So one of the characters that they kind of came up with was the cut job man, and he would do other things. And then I did it one more time for if you repaired and regenerated your community in the way that it needs, what are the things that have gone and are missing? And we put them all back in and did a kind of, like you might call it, eco-village design. And we did like all three of them, and we were in stitches like the whole time. It was very, very funny. And, afterwards, the other 7, we had a conversation every evening with the teachers, and, Albert kind of said, well, I've never seen anyone do it like that before. But it was like my attempt to say, and in the end, when they did their design projects like the people do at the end, we said to the teachers, will you do one for how you now take this? If you want to bridge it back into your communities, what will you do? Like what design could you come up with about, because they basically did reclaim it as their knowledge. And when they presented, they said, so we know all of this, but we didn't know how to teach it to our young people. But we want to have a center in our own communities. And one of the things that had happened by the Mayan Mountain PDCs was they said, we don't normally meet outside of our cultural groups. So the Mayan people don't normally meet. Many people in the Garifundai group and the East Indian groups don't really meet. The Creole groups, and they said, when we come here with, all of you, we meet each other. So they conceived of a vision of a Indigenous wisdom permaculture center that was for everyone, and that would be in their own village, away from like where Chris has developed, to say, it's great, we could go to you as a site visit, but we can't keep coming here. We've got to embed this back in our own community. And I was very fascinated by all of that. Now COVID hit and they've been in dire straits, and the women that I particularly made friends with, who want me to keep on talking to them, like they've been basically just looking after their immediate health needs of their communities. So that's a very long-winded story, but before we finish up, I'd love for you to touch on gender and what you said about, of course you wouldn't behave that way in permaculture, because I kind of think, but I think people do behave that way everywhere, and it's not like, I feel like there's a risk of saying we wouldn't do that in permaculture. It's like, we're the special folk.
Yeah, well, see, the thing is, I don't know if I ever really speak. I don't think I could ever speak for a whole culture, like permaculture as a culture.
No.
I guess when I speak, it's from a perspective of, and maybe this is where that kind of challenge becomes, because it becomes like the dogma of permaculture is this, and it gets bundled up as this thing, and what someone does over there affects what everyone. When I said, of course, I mean, that was coming from my perspective of like, well, of course,
of course you wouldn't.
I wouldn't ever do that, and that's the sensitivity and the real kind of experience of having worked in contexts like just as you described there, these for decades doing that kind of work. And when I hear people say that permaculture is just for white privileged folk, or it's it's not relevant to that culture. It goes over the top of that. I just sit and think, absolute, like, it's not my experience whatsoever where,
Yeah.
if as the way that we've been describing permaculture, and maybe that is a feminine approach to it, that it's not needing to know things, but needing, coming from the perspective of opening a conversation to explore like, what does that mean for you? How do we make sense of this together? Like, we are all here as humans, as people deeply concerned about the state of the world, deeply concerned about our families and about nutrition and about the forest and about the quality of the food and caring. I mean, essentially the basis of it all for me is about the quality of care, and
so that does sound like you're coming at it from a sensitivity that, like that, yeah, I think is more eroded. I mean, although you were saying, by the way, that your dad was interested in justice and, so on, but I think that development work, or that engagement with people from that same place. And I guess I mentioned to you that I spent 25 years working as an art therapist, so I was very drawn to that same place, that maybe this is the thing that, even though we actually only met very briefly and had a lot of daftness and hilarity and carrying on with each other, I think I was doing that as very much the balance. And it happens to me sometimes with the deepest seriousness, that we were engaging with, looking at the void, looking at the deep unknown, and looking at the long narrative of destruction and so on. And so for me, yeah, I definitely come back to a place of I need a bit of light relief here. It's really heavy, but I think that I find that company, that kind of immediacy of care, and also that, having a bit of daftness, I find that most with other women, with Indigenous people, and with children and young people. And I feel like they're all the people in the places who've been most oppressed by the system that we're talking about, and yet have somehow found caring for each other, caring for our children, caring for, like, that's the one, it's the ultimate resistance, really, isn't it? It's the only thing you get left with, is, well, I'm going to keep on caring, even though
how deeply can you care?
Yeah, even though it kind of is very, it's like the burnout you described at the beginning of the activism, even though that caring is pretty painful if you continue to do it all the time.
But there's a different type of caring, isn't there? Like, there was, like, I cared, like, I felt so deeply inside as a teenager that I cared about what was happening, that but I went out and I fought. Right. And it's that kind of is the exhausting bit. But when the resistance is more about, rather than fighting and knocking down stuff, I mean, it's about, it's a generative approach, isn't it? It's a generative approach of creating a new field or new connections, and through the caring, like, exploring the richness of the relationships, and reaching out and learn, like, the learning for, like, everyone has, like, I remember being part of starting up Northey Street City Farm, and some people would come down, would get the garden started, but I noticed these women who didn't come in, they would sort of be around the edge. And I think, that, like, there was this Taiwanese woman, I went and I was the kind of person who'd float around in the farm. I don't know if I did terribly much work sometimes, because I was always just talking to people. And I'd go over and I'd chat to her and I'd say, oh, what are you harvesting there? Because she was busy in the tree. And she said, oh, well, this is a tamarind tree. It was like a street tree. She'd discovered these row of street trees of tamarinds that had been planted by the council like decades ago. She said, and this is what we do with them. And then another guy came through another time from Timor and said, well, the tamarind tree, did you know that actually the leaves of this tree were what kept us alive during the famine? I was like, no, I didn't know that. It's like all of a sudden I'm looking at these massive trees transforming my perception of what it is that, and so it's through this conversation all the time and the richness. And you know, what I realized was like, it's that when you slow down enough to notice what's going on around you and to care to reach out, like that lady could have just kind of gone past, but when you do notice what that, and you reach out and you know, and you invite them to be part of what's happening or to open a conversation, something happens. And she said, oh no, I don't think I'd really like to come in. I don't feel comfortable, but I'm really happy to share with you what I do with all these plants. If you'd like me to show you, I'd be. And then so she did that. And then before you knew it, she was coming in and talking to everyone. It was just like, how do you find those points of connection to then weave new stories together? And so, yeah, I think for me, for like the core part of permaculture, I mean, it comes through in the ethics. And every time I come back to the ethics, you can kind of gloss over them, go, oh, earth care people care, fair share. You can like roll it off your tongue. But then when you come back to it, like it is essentially deeply about care. You know, and this is what we're just talking about now, and it's that very much about slowing and the noticing and reaching out, but also self-care. Like that's kind of one that I possibly don't do quite as well as, you know, I spend more time doing work outside than I do, you know. But
that's the Irish mammy in you.
Yeah, but at the same time, you know, I've chosen to live in this environment where I have, you know, like I purposely, you know, set this direction when I was really young to live in this eco village surrounded by permaculture. And like it took a long time, you know, like, you know, little bit by little bit, planting a cutting here, a stick of timber here, like just we didn't go into debt. We just, when we got a little bit more of stuff, we would just gradually make it. And so we're surrounded now by, yeah, the forest on one side, the gardens down there. We collect our water, you know, and I feel nourished by the environment and the community. You know, like the community is. I've lived here now for 21 years, so I'm still kind of a newbie, but we're all kind of new in this eco village. Just not much older than that, and. Right. And during COVID,
I do have that nourishment too. You know, it's not in an eco village, but I have community. And I suppose one of the things about Ireland is that community itself has not been completely eroded, despite like particularly in parts of rural Ireland, maybe there's huge damage in cities, there's huge damage, there's huge inequality. But I like during COVID, I hear you about to talk about during COVID, you know, like during COVID, the communities have looked after Ireland. You know, the communities that often with the least have stepped in and have done Meals on Wheels and organized runs and created all in the background with very little resource and gratitude, and with, you know, still obviously, like, you know, not in a just way, but at least it's not so eroded that feeling. And so in where I live, I've been able to, like, I have kind of people around me. I have you know, there is connections, there are, and we feel the same, that we also worked our way through trying to get access to land and managed to do that, you know, are still we have a little cottage. We still don't have a bathroom or a kitchen, but we're getting there. You know, it's been, but it is that, that's sort of that same where we began, that thing about the guilt, or how much you can change on an individual basis, and how much you can perhaps, like for me, if I don't align myself with the place, like when you talked about not being a landscape designer in a wealthy neighborhood where you could have accrued a lot of money, that you have to do it a slower way. That there's that if you're not going to buy into that, you're not going to immediately have the mortgage and immediately have the big house.
Mm. Yeah, and
But yeah,
it's
you have this other thing. I mean, I always say I have a lot of abundance in, Ethan's 8 Forms of Capital, permaculture guy from Appleseed Permaculture, and I say, yeah, I'm doing really well on 7 of them. Very abundant in social connection, in food, and like in all the like connection to my ecosystem and all these things. But yeah, not.
Yeah, there was something that I just interviewed a guy from limestone permaculture here in Australia, and he talked about how we moved. He was living that life. He was in the city, and he was a builder, and he was working endless hours, and he ended up going and buying a little 1-acre plot of land, and now his entire income is from this 1-acre land. And he says he has 11 streams of income, and one of the ones that he says that is really big and he really values the most is the gift economy. And he says, people come up to me, they've got, surplus fish or oysters or venison, all these things. He says, I couldn't possibly begin to think about how I'd be able to afford to eat as well as I do if it wasn't the fact that I had all this abundance to share from my 1-acre farm. And that the gift, and I think valuing the gift economy is something that happens when you enter into this space of this way of living. And I was just thinking, as you were speaking too, that I was feeling sad that Australia doesn't have the kind of village way of life, that traditional, like long time scale communities have, here we kind of came in and built cities and suburbs and a few
Right,
towns,
right,
and then
right.
random houses on hills and farms. There's not the village and the little web of local villages. And so I think this is where the eco-village concept becomes an important transition thinking. Like, obviously it's not something that everyone's going to go and live in an eco-village, but it's really about trying to demonstrate the scale of living in a village and what that's like. And when people come here, there's a sense of something of different happening. And it almost feels like they're noticing what you might notice if you were living in a village. Like, people knew each other. There's the local baker, there's the little local cafe, and there's the clothes exchange thing. And there was all these noticings that people have about what it's like. And I even have groups of school kids. I get them coming up here on camp from the city. And I was at the end of one session, it always stuck with me because we go around the circle at the end, and one of the things that they said was, oh, it's so amazing. Just like an hour or so away from this major city where we're from, there's this whole other civilization. It's like, wow. It's like, it's not that different, but it's different enough to notice that there's some other thing going on here, and to experience that. And I think that's the value of the eco village here, is to have a different place that has different values, and it's recognizable, but it's different.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I really have noticed by being more involved because of the advent, basically, of Zoom, that a mother, being tied to home and tied to land, I wasn't going off around the world easily. If we do go, it's these bigger trips with a lot of, like let's spend 2 years planning it, and then we'll go and take this big production. It's not easy to leave. But I have, through the International Permaculture Collab, and through Global Transition as well, and some also European networks, I have had in the last few years, more and more exposure to movements. And one of the things that I notice is that the capacity to do things is so much greater in the Global Eco Village network. That it's like, not only do you have one village, but you have a network of villages who've got your back. So that thing where almost the ability to take a risk as an individual or a family. It's sort of held within,
Mm-hmm.
it's held within your eco village that you're living in. And, like this is sort of what we're seeing some of through COVID, that there is still some of that in a crisis in Ireland. The community's got our back.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what doesn't happen is that in a non-crisis time, the skill of collaboration and the kind of focus on you must go it alone, you must make it as an individual, you can't be vulnerable and you can't be asking for help. That still, I think, outside of crisis times, that's the way people feel, and it's definitely the way my young people feel trying to go and make it in the world of a city, or like leave, our care and go and try and do it alone. They just feel hugely challenged, and I'm sure that's true of the young people you're talking about in the cities in Australia, where they just, how are they going to make it in this really difficult, generation of either get exploited by some big corporate where they can, be the means of production and sell it, or be like living in one of the more disadvantaged neighborhoods and trying to find any means of production that can keep them going. So I really noticed that service role that you're talking about, and it's kind of very heartening to me, that
And
the
I
eco
think,
village know its own capacity and is stepping back out and saying, okay, we've really got a lot here we can offer.
and I really believe too about the need to open to youth in permaculture in a way that makes sense to them. And so I'm really excited with Maya and the perma youth that's emerging now, is that it's not like, okay, well, we're going to run a program for youth and come on youth, come and do this program. It's different. They're starting to find each other, and they're finding each other through music, through art, through photography, through writing, through storytelling, through sharing their love of different passions that they've got, that they're exploring, and that they're coming together through that. And some of the things that's happening is remarkable. For example, because the connection of our work goes around the world, so they have people who come to their Zoom gatherings. Because of COVID, they have people from refugee settlements, from Bangladesh, from Sweden, from Australia, from all over, coming together, from Southeast Asia, and there's also America's hub. And these young refugee lads have decided that their way of they were able to raise. They always have free events, but then they raise money during those just from people donating. They might ask their parents or do a local raffle. They gather that money, and then they send that money to help offer free permaculture education in a refugee settlement. And so so there's a local teacher over there that we give the money to, and she gathers people, and they run their local programs. And some young lads came through that program and said, "This is it. And I've spoken to him just about every day since then. And he says, I was a street kid before this. I really didn't have any purpose. I didn't know where I was going, what I was doing. There's so much depression and violence and anxiety, drug use, sex offense, all these kind of things are going on, suicides." He says, "I discovered through this perma youth something that really made sense to me and gave me a chance to be self-reliant, and not self, but like I could do something with my community that we can actually address the growing hunger that we're experiencing ever since COVID. We've lost access to food support. So they don't actually get food sent in anymore. They just get $7 a month. They don't have enough to eat. They're struggling. And then as soon as they struggle, then all these other differences between the different people from different nations come in. So he said, this is a way that I can help the widows in my community. I can help the young orphans. And all of a sudden, I feel like I am somebody and I have something to contribute. I want to share this with everyone in the camp. I can't do it fast enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sing it. And I'm going to get together with other young people who are interested in music, and we're going to sing these songs. So he's now started, every time they have a Perm festival, he brings in another song, and it's in some of it's in English, some of it's in their language, and they have subtitles. He does it all on his little phone he's got, and he does music videos. Anyway, so we started to share these videos out. Anyway, the Grateful Dead Foundation have got onto this and said, this is amazing. And the young Somali wanted to have a studio where he could invite young people to come and have a voice, to be able to, be heard and to have something positive to do. So the Grateful Dead have said they're going to fund the building of this music video studio. And then normally the Grateful Dead say, one project, that's it, we're done. And then they said, this is such an amazing project. We would like to support the building of youth music studios in every camp. And so this is just emerging now. So from this little group of kids, essentially, coming together to saying, we want to do things that we care about, that matter to us. Mm-hmm. They're starting to change their worlds and therefore transform other people's worlds by whoever they touch. And so, I think the skills of permaculture, like when I look at what they're doing in Kakuma refugee settlement, in Rwanda refugee settlement, they're saying that these skills are what we need to be able to know that we whatever happens, we'll be okay.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like that's what a lot of young people need wherever they are. That sense of it's a deep sense of security. It is. And I don't think that that a lot of kids who are coming through standard school systems have that. Like if they don't get a job, if they don't get the right mark, if they don't get the right university course, if they don't get the right job, then they're incredibly insecure. And so redefining what security is, I think, is going to be something that so many of them need, because we're in such uncertain times.
Yeah. Listen, this has been amazing.
It has been, and I have so many more things I want to ask you about.
Me too.
Particularly, we're going to have to go another time,
do another one,
another conversation, because
But maybe we'll stop recording for the moment, and we can sign off.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me on my podcast, and it's a delight to join you on your podcast. What a great way to do it!
Absolutely fantastic. It's stacking functions, isn't that?
It's very permacultural.
That's great.
Thanks, Suzie. So that's all for today. Thanks so much for joining us. Head on over to my YouTube channel, the link's below, and then you'll be able to watch this conversation, but also make sure that you subscribe, because that way you'll be notified of all new films that come out, and also you'll get notified of all the new interviews and conversations that come out. So thanks again for joining us. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.